Jake Thompson had always dreamed of owning a little slice of paradise. After years of saving and searching, he finally found it. A charming cottage nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburban neighborhood. The house wasn't huge or flashy, but it had character. What really sold him, though, was the backyard. It was spacious, bathed in sunlight most of the day, and perfect for gardening, a hobby Jake loved more than anything else. From the moment he moved in, Jake poured his heart into making the property beautiful. He spent weekends planting flowers, trimming hedges, and laying down fresh mulch. Every corner of the yard was thoughtfully designed, from the winding stone path to the small fountain that bubbled softly near the fence. Neighbors often stopped by to admire his work, complimenting him on how inviting and well-maintained everything looked. For Jake, this praise meant the world. His garden wasn't just a hobby, it was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the stresses of everyday life. But living in a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, HOA, came with its own set of challenges. While some rules were reasonable, like keeping noise levels down after certain hours, others felt unnecessarily strict. There were guidelines about mailbox colors, fence heights, and even what kind of plants you could grow. Most residents followed these rules without complaint, but one person took them far too seriously: Karen Miller. Karen was infamous in the neighborhood. She chaired the HOA's compliance committee and seemed to have an uncanny ability to sniff out the tiniest infractions. If someone left their trash cans out past collection day or painted their front door a shade of blue not approved by the board, Karen would be the first to notice and report it. Some people joked that she carried a copy of the HOA handbook everywhere she went, ready to quote chapter and verse whenever necessary. Others avoided her altogether, knowing that crossing her could lead to endless headaches. Despite Karen's reputation, Jake tried to stay out of her way. He figured if he kept his property immaculate and followed the rules, there wouldn't be any reason for conflict. But fate had other plans. One sunny afternoon, as Jake was watering his flower beds, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Looking up, he saw Karen stepping out of her car, clipboard in hand and a determined look on her face. "Good afternoon, Jake," she said, striding toward him with purpose. Her tone was overly sweet, almost saccharine, which immediately put Jake on edge. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Jake replied, turning off the hose and wiping his hands on his jeans. "What can I do for you?" "Well," Karen began, flipping through the papers on her clipboard, "I've been reviewing our HOA guidelines, and I noticed your property falls under Section 4B. That means I need to conduct a routine inspection to ensure compliance. Just standard procedure." Jake blinked, caught off guard. He'd never heard of such a requirement before. "Routine inspection? I don't remember seeing anything about that in the HOA materials." "Oh, it's right here," Karen said, pointing to a paragraph on her clipboard. "It says members of the compliance committee are authorized to inspect properties periodically. Don't worry, it won't take long. Just a quick walk around, and we'll be done." Jake frowned. Something about this didn't sit right with him. His backyard was private, a space he cherished deeply. Letting Karen march through it felt invasive, especially since he hadn't given her permission. Plus, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really about compliance, it was about control. "I appreciate you doing your job, Karen," Jake said carefully, "but I'm going to have to decline. Unless you have written authorization from the HOA board, I can't allow anyone access to my property." Karen's smile faltered, replaced by a tight-lipped glare. "Are you refusing me entry?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Yes," Jake replied firmly. "I respect the rules, but I also value my privacy. If there's something specific you're concerned about, feel free to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. Otherwise, I think we're good here." For a moment, Karen stood frozen, clearly unaccustomed to being denied. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she snapped her clipboard shut. "Fine," she spat. "But don't say I didn't warn you. Non-compliance has consequences. Jake, mark my words." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car, slamming the door behind her. As she drove away, Jake couldn't help but feel uneasy. He knew Karen wasn't the type to let things go easily. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Over the next few days, Jake tried to push the encounter out of his mind. He focused on tending to his garden, preparing for an upcoming local gardening competition he hoped to enter. Still, the memory of Karen's parting threat lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a much bigger ordeal, one that would test his patience, resilience, and determination to stand up for himself. Karen didn't take Jake's refusal lightly. In fact, it only fueled her determination to make his life as difficult as possible. By the next morning, Jake noticed something strange. A handwritten flyer taped to his front door. It was titled "Important Notice to All Residents," and listed several vague complaints about unnamed homeowners who were allegedly violating HOA rules. While no names were mentioned, it was clear that Karen had him in mind. The flyer accused someone of neglecting community standards and urged neighbors to report suspicious activity immediately. Jake sighed, crumpled up the paper, and tossed it into the recycling bin. He knew better than to let Karen's antics get under his skin, but this was just the start. Over the following days, more flyers appeared around the neighborhood, each one worded slightly differently but carrying the same accusatory tone. Some neighbors began whispering behind Jake's back, wondering if he really was hiding something. Others rolled their eyes at Karen's dramatics, knowing full well she was targeting him. Determined not to give her any ammunition, Jake continued maintaining his property with extra care. He double-checked his mailbox alignment, swept leaves off the sidewalk daily, and made sure every blade of grass was perfectly trimmed. Still, Karen wasn't satisfied. She started parking outside his house late at night, peering through his fence with binoculars. Jake first noticed this when he stepped outside one evening to bring in the trash. There she was, sitting in her car like some kind of amateur detective, staring intently at his backyard. Frustrated but keeping his cool, Jake approached her vehicle. "Can I help you with something, Karen?" he asked, leaning down to look through the passenger window. Startled, Karen lowered her binoculars and rolled down the window halfway. "I'm just making sure everything is compliant," she replied, her voice dripping with insincerity. "You know, doing my duty as a member of the HOA at midnight?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't sound very routine to me." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Well, people don't always display their violations during daylight hours, do they? Sometimes things come out after dark." Jake crossed his arms. "If you're implying I'm doing something wrong, why don't you say it directly? Accusing me indirectly isn't going to solve anything." "I'm not accusing you of anything," Karen snapped, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her irritation. "But if you have nothing to hide, then why are you so defensive?" "Because you're trespassing on my time and privacy," Jake shot back. "If you want to file a complaint, go through proper channels, otherwise leave me alone." With that, Jake turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Karen fuming in her car. She revved the engine loudly before speeding off, clearly unhappy with how the confrontation had gone. But Jake knew this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted, or until she found a way to punish him for standing up to her. The next day, Jake received an email from the HOA board. It was from Karen, naturally, copied to every member of the association. The subject line read, "Urgent compliance issue." Inside, she detailed a laundry list of supposed infractions on Jake's property, ranging from overgrown shrubbery, which wasn't true, to potential unapproved structures, also false. She even attached blurry photos taken from outside, his fence claiming they proved her point. One picture showed a shadowy corner of his yard, which she insisted might be hiding a shed or tool shed without prior approval. Jake shook his head in disbelief as he scrolled through the email. It was ridiculous, baseless accusations backed by grainy images that could have been anyone's property. Worse yet, Karen ended the message by demanding immediate action. "Unless Jake grants me access to inspect his land within 48 hours, she wrote, "I will have no choice but to escalate this matter further." Her audacity astounded him. Not only was she trying to strong-arm him into compliance, but she was also attempting to turn the entire neighborhood against him. Jake decided enough was enough. He needed to fight back, not with anger, but with facts and professionalism. He spent the rest of the afternoon gathering evidence to counter Karen's claims. First, he reviewed the HOA handbook thoroughly, highlighting sections that supported his right to deny unauthorized access. Then, he took high-resolution photos of his property, documenting every detail to prove there were no violations. Finally, he drafted a polite but firm response to the HOA board, attaching all relevant materials. In his email, Jake addressed each of Karen's allegations point by point. For example, when she claimed his shrubs were overgrown, he provided measurements showing they were well within acceptable limits. When she accused him of having an unapproved structure, he included pictures proving the area in question was simply a pile of gardening supplies covered by a tarp. He also reminded everyone that Section 4B of the HOA guidelines explicitly stated inspections required written authorization from the board, not unilateral demands from individual members. Before hitting send, Jake took a deep breath. He knew responding publicly would draw attention, but staying silent wasn't an option either. With a final glance at his polished rebuttal, he clicked send and hoped for the best. As expected, Karen wasted no time firing back. Within minutes, she replied to his email, copying the entire HOA list once again. Her response was laced with thinly veiled insults, questioning Jake's honesty and suggesting he was deliberately obstructing her efforts to uphold community standards. She even threw in a dig about his gardening habits, implying his meticulousness was somehow suspicious. Jake ignored her theatrics and stuck to the facts. Instead of engaging in a back-and-forth argument, he forwarded both emails, the original complaint and his rebuttal, to the HOA board president, requesting a formal review of the situation. He emphasized his willingness to cooperate, but reiterated that Karen's actions were inappropriate and unwarranted. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her campaign. She began making unscheduled visits to Jake's house, knocking on his door at odd hours, and demanding entry. When he refused, she left passive-aggressive notes taped to his mailbox. One read, "Your secrecy speaks volumes," while another warned, "The truth always comes out eventually." Jake remained calm, refusing to let her bait him into losing his temper. He documented every interaction, taking photos of her notes and jotting down timestamps of her visits. If things came to a head, he wanted proof of her harassment. Despite the mounting pressure, Jake refused to back down. He believed in standing up for himself, not just for his own sake, but for the principle of it. Neighbors began noticing Karen's behavior too. Some openly expressed sympathy for Jake, telling him they thought Karen was being unreasonable. A few even admitted they'd faced similar treatment in the past but hadn't dared to challenge her. One evening, as Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on the absurdity of it all. Here he was, minding his own business, simply trying to enjoy his home. And yet, Karen seemed intent on turning his life upside down. But Jake wasn't afraid of a fight. He'd done nothing wrong, and he wasn't about to let someone bully him into submission. Little did he know, Karen's antics were about to reach new heights, and the neighborhood would soon find itself caught in the middle of a drama unlike anything it had seen before. Jake woke up the next morning determined to take control of the situation. He realized that dealing with Karen required more than just patience and polite responses. It needed strategy. After a quick breakfast, he sat down at his kitchen table with a notebook and began outlining his next steps. The first item on his list was clear: consult a lawyer. While Jake had done his best to handle things independently, he knew Karen's behavior was escalating beyond what could be resolved through simple communication. He called a local attorney recommended by a friend, someone who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. During their meeting later that day, Jake laid out everything that had happened, from Karen's initial demand for access to her late-night stakeouts and accusatory emails. The lawyer listened intently, nodding as Jake explained how Karen seemed intent on harassing him rather than addressing legitimate concerns. By the end of the conversation, Jake felt reassured. His lawyer advised him to document every interaction. with Karen moving forward, including saving all emails, texts, and notes about her visits. She also suggested installing security cameras around his property, not only to protect himself, but to gather evidence if necessary. That evening, Jake purchased 2 high-quality outdoor cameras and installed them discreetly along his fence line. One faced the driveway, capturing anyone approaching his house, while the other monitored the backyard where Karen often lingered. It wasn't something he wanted to do, inviting surveillance into his peaceful haven, but it was a necessary step to safeguard both his privacy and his rights. Feeling slightly more secure, Jake drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board. In it, he outlined Karen's pattern of harassment, providing dates, times, and descriptions of her actions. He included screenshots of her inflammatory emails and photos of the passive-aggressive notes she'd left on his mailbox. Most importantly, he attached legal advice from his attorney, reminding the board that denying unauthorized access to his property was not only his right, but protected under state law. The HOA board responded quickly, scheduling an emergency meeting to discuss the matter. They invited both Jake and Karen to attend, promising to mediate fairly. Though skeptical of Karen's ability to play nice, Jake agreed to participate. He prepared thoroughly, organizing his documents and rehearsing key points he wanted to make. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore. It was about setting a precedent for how conflicts should be handled within the community. On the day of the meeting, tension crackled in the air. The HOA board gathered in Karen's living room, a decision Jake found ironic given her accusations of impropriety. Chairs were arranged in a circle, creating an awkward attempt at neutrality. When Jake arrived, Karen was already seated, clutching her clipboard like a weapon. Her usual smug demeanor faltered slightly when she saw the stack of papers Jake carried, neatly labeled and bound. After brief introductions, the board president opened the floor for discussion. Karen went first, launching into a dramatic monologue about community values and the importance of transparency. She accused Jake of being uncooperative and hinted darkly at hidden violations, though she failed to provide concrete evidence. Her voice grew louder as she spoke, her frustration evident. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with her tone. When it was Jake's turn, he remained calm and composed. He presented his case methodically, starting with the HOA handbook itself. Pointing to specific clauses, he demonstrated that Section 4B did not grant individual members like Karen the authority to conduct inspections without prior approval from the board. He then addressed each of her allegations, using his photos and measurements to disprove every claim. The room fell silent as he flipped through his slideshow, showcasing the pristine condition of his yard and highlighting areas Karen had misrepresented. Karen interrupted frequently, her voice rising with indignation. "How can we trust these pictures?" she demanded at one point. "They could have been staged." Jake smiled faintly. "If you'd like, I'm happy to give everyone a live tour of my property right now. You'll see firsthand that everything is exactly as I've described." This offer visibly rattled Karen. She stammered, trying to regain control of the narrative. "That's not the point," she exclaimed. "The point is that you're refusing to cooperate, which raises questions about your intentions." Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "My intentions are simple. I want to live peacefully in my home without being harassed or intimidated. If there's a legitimate concern, bring it to the board, and we'll address it together. But I won't tolerate personal vendettas disguised as compliance checks." The board president intervened before Karen could respond, steering the conversation back to mediation. They proposed a compromise. Karen would drop her demands for immediate access, and Jake would agree to a scheduled inspection conducted by 2 neutral board members instead of Karen alone. Both parties hesitated, but eventually they nodded in agreement. The meeting adjourned with promises to reconvene after the inspection. Despite the temporary resolution, Jake knew this wasn't over. As he packed up his materials and prepared to leave, Karen cornered him near the door. Her face was flushed, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her clipboard. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice low enough that only Jake could hear. "But I'm not done with you yet. Jake met her gaze steadily. I never wanted this fight, Karen, but if you keep pushing, don't be surprised when you lose. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment it looked like she might say something else. Instead, she turned sharply and stormed out of the room, leaving Jake alone with the lingering sense that trouble still loomed on the horizon. Over the next few days, Jake focused on preparing for the upcoming inspection. He tidied up his tools, pruned a few stray branches, and ensured every inch of his property gleamed. He wasn't worried about the results. He knew his yard was impeccable, but he wanted to leave no room for doubt. Meanwhile, rumors swirled throughout the neighborhood about the tense meeting at Karen's house. Some residents sympathized with Jake, while others whispered that maybe he really was hiding something. Jake ignored the gossip, trusting that the truth would speak for itself. On the morning of the inspection, 2 HOA board members arrived promptly at 10 a.m., armed with clipboards and measuring tapes. They greeted Jake warmly, apologizing for the inconvenience and assuring him they were there purely to observe and report. Together, they walked through the property, examining every detail. Jake answered their questions politely, pointing out features like the irrigation system he'd installed and the native plants he'd chosen to support local wildlife. By the time they finished, the board members were impressed. "Your yard is truly beautiful," one of them said sincerely. "We didn't find anything close to a violation here." Relieved but unsurprised, Jake thanked them for their time. As they drove away, he allowed himself a small smile. For now, at least, he'd proven his point, but deep down he knew Karen wouldn't let this go so easily. Her parting threat still echoed in his mind, and he suspected she was already plotting her next move. What Jake didn't realize was that Karen's retaliation would come faster and hit harder than anyone anticipated. Unbeknownst to him, she had already taken her grievances beyond the confines of the HOA, setting off a chain of events that would thrust him into the spotlight in ways he couldn't have imagined. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The inspection had gone exactly as Jake predicted, flawless with 0 violations found, but that didn't stop her from doubling down on her crusade. If anything, it made her angrier. She saw the board's findings not as proof of Jake's innocence, but as evidence of a conspiracy against her. To Karen, it was clear. Everyone was in on it, working together to undermine her authority and protect Jake. Determined to expose what she believed was a cover-up, Karen began spending hours poring over old HOA records, searching for any loophole or technicality she could exploit. Her dining table was soon buried under stacks of papers, highlighters, and sticky notes. Every now and then she'd mutter to herself, scribbling furiously in the margins of documents. When she couldn't find anything substantial, she resorted to nitpicking minor details, convinced they would add up to something damning if presented just right. Her obsession reached new heights when she decided to take matters into her own hands again. Late one evening, she parked her car several houses away from Jake's and crept along the sidewalk, peering through his fence with her trusty binoculars. The security cameras Jake had installed glowed faintly in the darkness, their lenses swiveling silently as they tracked her movements. Karen cursed under her breath, knowing she was being recorded, but she pressed on anyway. She snapped blurry photos of his backyard with her phone, convinced she'd finally uncover the smoking gun she needed to bring him down. The next morning, Karen marched into the HOA board president's home unannounced, clutching a manila folder stuffed with her latest discoveries. "I need to speak with you immediately," she declared, slamming the folder onto the kitchen counter. The president, mid-coffee, sighed deeply. He'd hoped the recent inspection would put an end to this saga, but Karen's persistence was relentless. Inside the folder were grainy nighttime photos of Jake's yard, annotated with arrows and exclamation points. One image showed a shadowy corner near his shed circled in red marker. "See this?" Karen pointed dramatically. "It's clearly some kind of structure, or maybe even a pile of debris. How do we know it's not hazardous materials? What if he's violating environmental regulations?" The president pinched the bridge of his nose. "Karen, these pictures are practically indecipherable. Even if there is something back there, and I highly doubt it, it's not enough to justify further action." "But you haven't seen it up close," Karen insisted. You're relying on Jake's word instead of doing your job properly. Jake has cooperated fully, the president replied firmly. The inspection proved there's nothing to worry about. At this point, continuing to pursue this matter seems excessive. Karen bristled at the implication. Excessive? Was he suggesting she was the problem here? Before she could respond, the president stood up, signaling the conversation was over. Let's move forward, Karen. Focus on other priorities. This isn't helping anyone. Fuming, Karen stormed out, vowing to escalate things beyond the HOA. If they wouldn't listen to reason, she'd find someone who would. And so she turned her attention to local media outlets, hoping to turn public opinion against Jake once and for all. A few days later, Jake's peaceful morning routine was shattered by the sound of car doors slamming outside his house. Confused, he stepped onto his porch to investigate, and froze. A group of reporters and camera crews had gathered at the end of his driveway, microphones in hand and cameras rolling. At the center of the chaos stood Karen, gesturing wildly as she spoke to a journalist. And that's why residents should be concerned, she was saying, her voice dripping with urgency. There's no telling what's really going on behind closed gates. We deserve answers. Jake blinked, stunned. What on earth was happening? As the reporters noticed him standing on the porch, they turned their attention toward him, shouting questions all at once. Mr. Thompson, are you hiding illegal structures on your property? Can you explain these alleged zoning violations? Is true you've been fined multiple times by the HOA? Jake held up his hands, trying to calm the crowd. Hold on, he said loudly. One question at a time, please. He quickly realized this wasn't going to be resolved on the spot. With a deep breath, he invited the reporters inside, deciding it was better to face the storm head-on than let rumors spiral out of control. Leading them through his immaculate garden, he gave a guided tour, pointing out features like the flower beds, vegetable patch, and koi pond. Everything was visible, open, and above board. This is ridiculous, Jake said calmly as they reached the infamous shadowy corner Karen had ranted about. There was nothing there except a neatly stacked pile of gardening supplies covered by a tarp. As you can see, there's absolutely nothing suspicious here. The reporters exchanged skeptical glances. Sensing their doubts, Jake pulled out copies of the inspection report, complete with signatures from the HOA board members who had visited his property. He also shared receipts for recent landscaping projects and permits for minor renovations, proving everything was done legally. One particularly sharp-eyed reporter noticed Karen lingering near the edge of the group, pretending to observe while avoiding direct involvement. Recognizing her from previous stories involving neighborhood disputes, he approached her. Ms. Miller, correct? You tipped us off about this story. Can you clarify what specific concerns you have about Mr. Thompson's property? Caught off guard, Karen stammered. Well, it's not just about his property, it's about accountability. People need to follow the rules, and if they don't, well... She trailed off, unable to articulate a coherent argument. Are you accusing Mr. Thompson of breaking any laws? The reporter pressed. No, but he's uncooperative. Karen blurted out, her composure crumbling. He won't let me inspect his yard whenever I want. That's suspicious behavior, isn't it? The reporter raised an eyebrow. So, your issue boils down to personal access, not actual violations. Karen flushed bright red, realizing too late that she'd dug herself into a hole. Mumbling something incoherent, she backed away from the microphone and disappeared into the crowd. By the time the press left, Jake felt drained, but oddly relieved. The reporters seemed satisfied with his transparency, and several promised to write balanced articles explaining the situation. Still, the experience left him shaken. He hadn't asked for this kind of attention, and he worried about how it might affect his relationships with neighbors. That evening, as he sat on his porch nursing a cup of tea, Jake reflected on the absurdity of it all. Karen's attempt to paint him as some sort of villain had completely backfired. Not only had she failed to prove her accusations, but she'd also exposed herself as petty and vindictive. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood, and soon enough whispers spread about Karen's embarrassing performance in front of the cameras. For the first time since this ordeal began, Jake allowed himself a small smile. Maybe, Just maybe this nightmare was finally coming to an end. But as the stars twinkled overhead, Jake couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen wasn't finished yet. Her pride had taken a beating, and people like her rarely walked away quietly. Whatever came. Next, Jake knew he'd have to stay vigilant and ready to defend himself once more. The fallout from Karen's failed media stunt was swift and brutal. By the next morning, snippets of her interview had gone viral on social media, with captions like, "HOA enforcer loses it over neighbor's garden," and "Karen versus the gardener, suburban drama at its finest." Neighbors, who had previously stayed neutral in the conflict, began sharing memes mocking Karen's behavior, while others openly praised Jake for handling the situation with grace under pressure. Even local news outlets followed up with additional coverage, highlighting how Karen's accusations crumbled under scrutiny. Jake woke up to a barrage of notifications on his phone, messages from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers congratulating him for standing up to Karen. Some neighbors stopped by throughout the day to offer their support, bringing homemade cookies or simply shaking his hand. One elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, who lived 2 doors down, told him, "You've handled this whole mess with such dignity, Jake. We're lucky to have someone like you in the neighborhood." While the outpouring of kindness warmed Jake's heart, he couldn't help but feel sorry for Karen. He didn't relish seeing anyone humiliated, especially over something so trivial. Still, he knew her actions had consequences, and it was time for her to face them. Over the next few days, Karen became a pariah in the community. People avoided eye contact with her at the grocery store, and her usual cronies stopped inviting her to book club meetings or coffee dates. Her attempts to rally support fell flat. No one wanted to be associated with her antics anymore. Feeling isolated and desperate, Karen doubled down on her efforts to discredit Jake. She started spreading rumors door to door, claiming that Jake had bribed the HOA board and reporters to cover up his supposed violations. But her claims lacked credibility, and most residents dismissed them as sour grapes. When she tried to organize an emergency HOA meeting to discuss ongoing compliance issues, only a handful of people showed up, and half of them were there, just to see if Karen would embarrass herself again. Despite her dwindling influence, Karen refused to back down. Instead, she shifted tactics, focusing on undermining Jake's reputation within the gardening community. After all, Jake had been preparing to enter his prized garden into a prestigious regional competition, and Karen saw an opportunity to strike where it hurt most. She anonymously contacted the event organizers, alleging that Jake's property might contain invasive plant species banned by local regulations. This accusation forced the organizers to send an inspector to verify the claim, a process that delayed Jake's entry and added unnecessary stress to his preparations. When Jake learned about Karen's latest move, he was both frustrated and impressed by her tenacity. "She really doesn't give up, does she?" he muttered to himself as he answered questions from yet another inspector. Fortunately, the garden passed with flying colors, and the inspector assured Jake that his entry would proceed as planned. Still, the delay rankled him. He couldn't understand why Karen was so fixated on ruining his life when she could easily walk away and save herself further embarrassment. As word of Karen's interference spread among the neighbors, resentment toward her grew stronger. Many residents were tired of her constant drama and began speaking out against her at HOA meetings. At one gathering, a young couple who had recently moved into the neighborhood stood up and addressed the board. "We chose this community because it seemed peaceful and welcoming," the husband said. "But lately, we've seen nothing but division and hostility. Isn't it time we focused on building trust instead of tearing each other down?" His words resonated with others, sparking a lively discussion about the future of the neighborhood. For the first time in years, residents openly criticized the HOA's strict enforcement policies, arguing that they fostered fear rather than cooperation. Several people suggested replacing outdated rules with more flexible guidelines that encouraged creativity and individuality. The board listened intently, realizing that the community was ready for change. Inspired by this newfound spirit of unity, Jake decided to take action. He organized a neighborhood barbecue, inviting everyone, including Karen, to come together and celebrate what made their community special. Flyers went up around the subdivision advertising free food, live music, and games for kids. Jake hoped the event would serve as a reset button, allowing neighbors to reconnect and rebuild relationships strained by months of tension. On the day of the barbecue, the weather was perfect, sunny with a gentle breeze. Tables laden with potluck dishes lined the cul-de-sac, and colorful balloons bobbed in the wind. Residents mingled freely, laughing and chatting as children ran around playing tag. Even the usually stoic HOA board members loosened their ties and joined in the festivities. The atmosphere was warm and inclusive, a stark contrast to the hostility that had dominated recent months. Karen arrived late, wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching a plate of store-bought brownies. She hovered, near the edge of the crowd, clearly uncomfortable. Most attendees ignored her, though a few shot her curious glances. Jake spotted her lingering awkwardly by the dessert table and approached her with a smile. "Thanks for coming, Karen," he said warmly. "I hope you're enjoying yourself." Karen hesitated, unsure how to respond. I guess it's nice," she mumbled, avoiding eye-direct contact. "Though I still think some things need to be addressed." Jake nodded understandingly. "Of course. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. But maybe we can find ways to work together instead of against each other. What do you say?" For a moment, Karen looked conflicted. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked away, leaving her uneaten brownies behind. As she disappeared, down the street, Jake sighed but felt a sense of closure. He doubted Karen would ever fully let go of her grievances, but at least the rest of the neighborhood was moving forward. Over the next few weeks, positive changes swept through the community. The HOA revised several unpopular rules, including those related to landscaping and outdoor decor. A new committee formed to plan regular events like block parties and holiday celebrations, fostering a greater sense of camaraderie among residents. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other now exchanged greetings and offered help when needed. Meanwhile, Jake threw himself into finalizing his garden for the upcoming competition. With Karen's distractions finally behind him, he poured all his energy into perfecting every detail. He added whimsical touches like fairy lights strung between trees and hand-painted signs labeling different sections of the garden. Friends and neighbors stopped by to admire his progress, offering encouragement and last-minute suggestions. Finally, the big day arrived. The regional gardening competition took place at a sprawling park filled with elaborate displays from contestants across the state. Jake's garden stood out immediately, drawing crowds with its vibrant colors, thoughtful design, and serene ambiance. Judges spent nearly half an hour touring the space, asking detailed questions and taking copious notes. When the awards ceremony began, Jake sat nervously among the other finalists, clutching his program tightly. As the announcer read off the winners in various categories, his heart sank slightly. His name hadn't been called yet. But then came the grand prize announcement, Best Overall Garden. And the winner is... The announcer paused dramatically before continuing. Jake Thompson. The crowd erupted into applause as Jake stepped onto the stage, stunned but elated. Accepting the trophy, he thanked the judges, his supporters, and even the challenges that had pushed him to create something truly special. Back home, his victory celebration drew hundreds of attendees, cementing his status as a beloved figure in the neighborhood. As fireworks lit up the night sky, Jake reflected on everything he'd been through. From Karen's relentless harassment to the unexpected support of his neighbors, the journey had tested his patience, resilience, and faith in humanity. In the end, he realized it wasn't just about winning a competition or defending his property. It was about proving that kindness, integrity, and determination could overcome even the toughest obstacles. And somewhere in the distance, watching, silently from her window, Karen watched the festivities with mixed emotions. Whether she'd learned anything from the experience remained unclear, but for now, peace had returned to the neighborhood, and that was enough.